My husband died at 1 a.m. They handed me his bloody watch, and before I could even process the grief, my water broke. I called my mother from the delivery room, terrified and completely alone. She answered the phone from the airport. She calmly told me that she and my older sister were upgrading their seats to Paris and to stop being dramatic. I went completely silent. 5 months later, my sister showed up at my driveway demanding a massive piece of my late husband's estate. She had no idea I was a forensic accountant, and she was about to learn that crossing a grieving widow comes with a devastating price. My name is Cassidy, 33 years old, and my life shattered into a million pieces on a Tuesday night. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever realized that the people who share your DNA can be the most toxic strangers of all. The harsh glare of the fluorescent lights in the emergency room is burned into my memory forever. The sound was the worst part. The continuous agonizing screech of the heart monitor flatlining. It echoed off the sterile white walls, drowning out the frantic shouts of the medical team. A young doctor stepped out from behind the trauma curtain. His scrubs were stained, and his eyes carried a heavy exhaustion. He did not have to say a single word. I knew. My husband Daniel, the man I was supposed to build a family with, was gone. A nurse approached me a few moments later. She handed me a plastic hospital belongings bag. Inside was Daniel's watch, the glass face completely shattered, and his wedding ring still smeared with his blood. I stared at the plastic bag, my hands trembling uncontrollably. My chest tightened so severely that I forgot how to breathe. The world spun in dizzying circles. I tried to stand up from the cheap plastic waiting room chair, desperately wanting to go to him, to shake him awake, to tell him this was a terrible nightmare. Then a sharp, tearing pain ripped through my lower abdomen. It was a physical agony so intense it forced me back down into the chair. I gasped, clutching my swollen belly. A warm rush of fluid soaked through my clothes, pooling onto the linoleum floor. The sheer shock of Daniel's death had triggered my body into premature labor. I was only 36 weeks pregnant. Panic erupted around me all over again. The same nurses who had just fought to save my husband were now rushing toward me with a wheelchair. They hoisted me into the chair and sprinted down the corridor toward the maternity ward. Everything was a blur of ceiling lights and shouting voices. The pain in my stomach was blinding, coming in rapid, suffocating waves. I was terrified beyond human comprehension. I was losing the love of my life and bringing our son into the world on the exact same night. The cruelty of the universe felt like a physical weight crushing my lungs. They shoved me into a delivery room, moving with terrifying speed. A nurse with kind eyes grabbed my shoulders, forcing me to look at her. She asked me questions I could barely understand. Name, blood type, allergies. Then she asked the one question that made my reality shatter all over again. She needed my emergency contact. I choked on a violent sob. Daniel was my emergency contact. He was always my emergency contact. For 5 years, he had been my anchor, my family, my completely safe place. Now he was lying lifeless in a trauma bay just down the hall. The nurse squeezed my hand tightly, her voice urgent. She told me my blood pressure was dangerously high and my baby was in severe distress. She needed a name and a phone number immediately. If I had to go into emergency surgery, someone needed to make medical decisions for me. Someone needed to be there to claim my son if I did not survive the procedure. I had no one else. Daniel's parents had passed away years ago, and my own circle of friends felt a million miles away at 1 in the morning. I was completely isolated in the most terrifying moment of my existence. I had only one option left. I had to call the woman who gave birth to me. My mother, Patricia. I gave the nurse her number, my voice barely a whisper. My mother and I did not have a warm relationship. She was a woman who valued suburban appearances, above all else, heavily favoring my older sister Ashley, the undeniable golden child of our family. I was just the quiet, independent daughter who worked as a forensic accountant and married a software engineer she deemed too ordinary for her high society standards. But surely in a matter of life and death, a mother would drop everything. Surely hearing that her son-in-law was dead, and her daughter was fighting for her life would strip away the toxic vanity. The nurse handed me a hospital phone. My hands shook so violently I could barely hold the receiver to my ear. I listened to the ringing tone, squeezing my eyes shut as another brutal contraction tore through my body. I prayed she would pick up. I prayed she would tell me everything was going to be okay. I needed my mother. The ringing finally stopped and the line clicked open. Hello? My mother's voice was sharp, laced with an annoyance that I had interrupted something important. Before I could even speak to her, the unmistakable chaos of a busy airport terminal flooded through the receiver. I could hear the rhythmic, heavy thud of suitcases rolling over tile floors, and a gate agent echoing through a loudspeaker, announcing the final boarding call for an international flight. "Mom!" I gasped. My voice barely recognizable as another wave of blinding pain ripped through my abdomen. "It is Daniel. There was a car accident on his way home from the office. Mom, he is gone. He is dead. I am at the hospital and they are rushing me into an emergency delivery right now. My blood pressure is crashing. The doctors say I might not make it through the surgery. I am completely alone. Please, I need you to come." I gripped the plastic hospital phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I waited for the sharp gasp. I waited for the sudden shift in her tone, the maternal instinct to finally kick in the frantic questions about which hospital room I was in. Instead, there was a heavy, irritated sigh. It was the exact sigh she gave when a waiter brought her the wrong vintage of wine at a country club dinner. "Cassidy, please stop being so dramatic," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "Do you have any idea what time it is and where we are?" "We are standing at the boarding gate at JFK. I blinked, the sterile lights of the delivery room suddenly feeling blinding. JFK. Mom, what are you talking about? My husband just died. I am about to be cut open. I am talking about the fact that Ashley and I just paid $12,000 to upgrade our seats to Paris, she snapped as if explaining something to a slow toddler. It is her 35th birthday trip. We have been planning this luxury getaway for 6 months. You know how much your sister needs this vacation after the stress of her home renovations. I am not throwing away a first-class transatlantic flight and a non-refundable suite at the Ritz just because you are having a panic attack. A loud, mocking laugh echoed in the background. It was Ashley. I could picture her perfectly standing there in her designer travel sweatsuit, sipping a complimentary lounge mimosa. "Tell her to stop trying to ruin my birthday trip," Ashley yelled into the background. "She always does this. She always has to make everything about her." My mother chuckled in agreement. "You hear that? Your sister is right. You always have to manufacture a fake crisis when the spotlight is not on you. Listen to me, Cassidy. Women have babies every single day. It is a completely natural biological process. You do not need me holding your hand like a child. As for Daniel, if what you are saying is actually true, and you are not just exaggerating a fender bender for attention, there is nothing I can do for him anyway. He is already gone. Me missing my flight will not bring your husband back to life." The monitor next to my bed began to beep more frantically. The nurse with the kind eyes looked at me with sheer horror. She had heard every single word echoing from the receiver. She reached out silently, offering to take the phone and yell at my mother herself. I shook my head, my tears completely drying up. The blinding physical pain in my stomach was suddenly eclipsed by a cold, absolute clarity. In my darkest hour of human suffering, they chose a luxury vacation over my survival. "Just call an Uber when you are discharged from the maternity ward." My mother continued, her tone brisk and final. "Send me a picture of the baby when you are settled at home. We will buy him a nice souvenir. Now I have to go. Have a safe delivery." I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button. The line went dead. I handed the receiver back to the nurse. My hands had completely stopped shaking. A bizarre, icy calm washed over my entire body. I looked at the medical team surrounding my hospital bed and gave them a single nod. "Block her number," I told the nurse, my voice steady. "Block my sister's number too. If they ever show up at this hospital, call security and have them arrested for trespassing. From this second forward, I do not have a mother. I do not have a sister. I have absolutely no family left except the boy inside me. Now cut me open and save my little son." I woke up hours later to the steady rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. The blinding pain in my abdomen had dulled to a deep, agonizing ache, heavily masked by intravenous painkillers. The recovery room was cast in the dim gray light of early morning. I slowly turned my head and saw a transparent plastic bassinet beside my bed. Inside, wrapped in a striped hospital blanket, was my son. He was tiny, perfect, and breathing steadily. I reached out with a trembling hand and rested my fingers against his warm cheek. A tear slid down my face, but it was not a tear of despair. It was a vow. I was going to protect this boy with every ounce of strength I possessed. Over the next 4 days in the maternity ward, my phone remained completely silent. There were no missed calls from Paris. There were no text messages asking if I survived the surgery. There were no expensive floral arrangements delivered to the nurse's station. My mother and sister had simply continued their luxury vacation drinking champagne in front of the Eiffel Tower, while I arranged my husband's cremation from a hospital bed. I paid the funeral home over the phone, holding my newborn son in my other arm. The silence from my blood relatives was absolute, but it was also liberating. On the 5th day, a nurse wheeled me out to a waiting taxi. I carried my son up the driveway of the home Daniel and I had shared. The house was freezing, and the silence inside was deafening. Daniel's boots were still kicked off by the front door. His coffee mug was still sitting in the sink from the morning he left. The crushing weight of the emptiness threatened to snap me in half. Most new widows would have collapsed onto the floor and completely surrendered to the grief. But I could not afford that luxury. I had a son who depended on my survival. Instead of breaking down, I laid my sleeping baby in his crib, walked straight into Daniel's home office, and sat at his desk. I am a forensic accountant. For over a decade, my entire career has been built on dissecting complex financial webs, tracking missing assets, and exposing hidden frauds. Numbers do not ever lie to you. Numbers do not betray you at an airport terminal. I needed a distraction from the blinding pain of my reality, and Daniel's messy estate was the only puzzle left to solve. I opened his laptop. It was password protected, but I knew Daniel better than anyone. I typed in the coordinates of the beach where he proposed, and the screen instantly unlocked. I bypassed his personal emails and went straight into his financial directories. Daniel was a brilliant software developer, but his accounting skills were notoriously chaotic. We kept our finances mostly separate because my meticulous nature clashed with his disorganized habits. But as I started pulling his bank statements, tax returns, and investment portfolios, my professional instincts immediately flared. Something was fundamentally wrong. Large sums of capital were hemorrhaging from his primary accounts, funneled into a labyrinth of obscure wire transfers. I spent hours writing algorithms to trace the digital footprint of the missing money. By midnight, my spreadsheets revealed a massive anomaly. Daniel had quietly liquidated a significant portion of his stock options 3 years ago to fund a hidden limited liability company registered in Delaware. He never mentioned this company to me. He never declared it on our joint tax filings. My heart pounded against my ribs. I ran a deep registry search on the company name and found a buried server directory on his hard drive. It was secured behind military-grade encryption. I ran a brute force decryption software I used for corporate audits. It took 6 hours of relentless processing, but just as the sun began to rise over the suburban skyline, the security wall finally cracked. A single heavily encrypted folder appeared on the center of the screen. I moved the cursor over the file, my breath catching in my throat. The folder was labeled Patricia and Ashley Liabilities. I clicked open the first subfolder, and a mountain of PDF documents flooded the screen. Promissory notes, mortgage bailouts, credit card payoffs. My late husband had not just been running a software firm, he had been quietly operating as a secret financial safety net for the two women who had abandoned me to die. The grief evaporating from my body was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating rage. They thought they were dealing with a heartbroken widow. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded gun to a forensic accountant. I leaned back in my black leather office chair, fully prepared for a ruthless and unforgiving war. Over the next 5 months, while my son slept soundly in his crib, I spent every waking hour dissecting the financial grave my husband left behind. The deeper I dug into the encrypted folder, the more sickening the truth became. Daniel had not just been generous. He had been manipulated, guilt-tripped, and financially bled dry by my mother and sister for years. I found emails from Patricia crying about losing her status in the community, begging him for cash injections. I found wire transfers to Ashley's accounts, covering luxury car leases and designer wardrobes that her husband Andre was completely unaware of. But the most shocking discovery was the property deed. 7 years ago, my mother's sprawling $1.5 million colonial home had gone into foreclosure. She had always bragged about her impeccable financial standing at her country club luncheons, looking down on everyone else. The reality was, she had defaulted on her mortgage. To save her from public humiliation, Daniel had used his secret limited liability company to purchase the banknote outright. My mother had been living in that house completely rent-free for 7 years. And because I was Daniel's sole heir, that LLC now belonged entirely to me. I was officially Patricia's landlord. Then I turned my attention to Ashley. My sister loved to portray the perfect wealthy housewife on social media, married to Andre, a highly respected orthopedic surgeon. Andre was a good man, principled and strict about finances, boasting a pristine 820 credit score. Ashley knew Andre would never fund her reckless shopping addictions, so she bypassed him entirely. I uncovered a trail of digital breadcrumbs showing Ashley had been funneling money out of Daniel's accounts to cover the minimum payments on massive high-interest credit cards she had secretly opened. Worse, I found credit applications in Daniel's files where Ashley had used Andre's social security number to secure those loans without his knowledge. Daniel had been covering the tracks of a federal financial crime. The betrayal tasted like ash in my mouth, but it fueled my focus. I did not waste a single tear. Instead, I went to war the only way a forensic accountant knows how. I secured every single document. I downloaded the metadata proving the exact dates and IP addresses of every transaction. I quietly hired the most ruthless probate attorney in the city, an older gentleman named Richard, who specialized in aggressively dismantling complex estates. Together, we legally transferred all of Daniel's business assets, the LLC, and the property deeds directly into my name. We built an ironclad legal fortress around my son's inheritance. By the end of the 3rd month, I had compiled 3 massive color-coded binders. They were my armory. Binder 1 contained the irrefutable proof of my mother's foreclosure and my ownership of her home. Binder 2 documented every single wire transfer Daniel had ever sent to my sister. Binder 3 held the explosive evidence of Ashley committing identity theft against her own husband. I locked the binders inside a heavy fireproof safe in my home office. I was no longer a grieving, vulnerable widow. I was a loaded weapon just waiting for them to pull the trigger. Months 4 and 5 were eerily quiet. I bonded with my baby boy, watching him grow stronger and more alert every single day. I healed from my surgery, regaining my physical strength. I managed my corporate accounting clients, remotely returning to work with a laser-sharp focus. The silence from my mother and sister did not bother me anymore. In fact, I welcomed it. I knew exactly why they were giving me space. They were waiting for the estate to settle. They assumed I was overwhelmed with grief and motherhood, too weak to look into Daniel's finances. They thought the secret gravy train was just temporarily delayed. They were bound to run out of money. The designer credit card bills would start piling up. The maintenance fees on my mother's house would go unpaid. I knew it was only a matter of time before their fabricated, wealthy lifestyle began to collapse around them. They would come looking for Daniel's money, expecting to easily steamroll the quiet, obedient daughter they had abandoned at the hospital. I knew they would not call first. They would try to ambush me, hoping to catch me off guard in my pajamas, exhausted and desperate for their approval. But those days were over. The frightened girl who begged for her mother on the phone was dead. Every afternoon, I would take my son for a walk in his stroller, looking down the quiet suburban street, calmly anticipating their arrival. I had the documents. I had the legal authority. I had the truth. Let them come. The sun was warm against my skin on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was pushing the stroller down my long concrete driveway, enjoying the peaceful suburban silence. Then, the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine shattered the calm. A pristine white Range Rover swerved violently off the main road, cutting the corner too sharply and tearing up a large patch of my freshly cut front lawn. The heavy vehicle slammed to a halt right in front of me, kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel. I stopped the stroller and calmly locked the wheels, knowing exactly who was inside before the engine even cut off. The heavy car doors swung open. My mother Patricia stepped out first. She was draped in a tailored cashmere coat that likely cost more than my first vehicle, her hair perfectly blown out, not a single strand out of place. Ashley emerged from the passenger side a second later, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses and aggressively clutching a limited edition crocodile skin handbag. Neither of them wore mourning clothes. Neither of them carried a single ounce of grief in their posture. They marched briskly up the driveway toward me, their expensive heels clicking sharply against the pavement like an invading army. They did not glance down into the stroller to look at the grandson and nephew they had never met. They did not ask how my surgical recovery went. They did not offer a single word of condolence for the husband I had buried alone. They acted as if my son simply did not exist. Their absolute lack of basic human decency was astonishing yet completely expected. Patricia stopped a mere 2 feet away from me, invading my personal space. She did not offer a hug. Instead, she aggressively reached into her luxury handbag and pulled out a sharply folded piece of white paper. "We need to settle this matter immediately," my mother said, her voice cold, commanding and completely devoid of empathy. "I have given you 5 months to mourn your loss, Cassidy. That is more than enough time to sit around feeling sorry for yourself. The estate should be out of probate by now. I expect the $300,000 transferred directly into my primary checking account by the end of this week. I will not accept any excuses or delays. You are going to make this right immediately." I kept my hands resting lightly on the handle of the stroller, my expression completely unreadable. $300,000, I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. Ashley let out a loud theatrical sigh, shifting her weight and crossing her arms defensively over her chest. She rolled her eyes dramatically. "Do not play dumb with us," Ashley snapped, tapping her manicured fingernails against her expensive purse. "Mom loaned Daniel the money right before his little car accident. His miserable software company was going completely under, and he practically begged her for a massive financial bailout just to keep his servers running and the lights on. You owe her that money." Patricia violently thrust the folded piece of paper right into my face. "It is a legally binding promissory note," she declared proudly, a smug and victorious smirk playing on her lips. "Daniel signed it himself. I had my lawyer draft it up. Since you inherited his entire estate and all of his remaining assets, his outstanding debts are now your legal responsibility. I expect you to liquidate whatever pitiful tech investments he had and pay me back every single penny. If you have to sell this rundown house to do it, then you need to call a real estate agent today." I reached out slowly and took the crisp piece of paper from her manicured fingers. I unfolded it, my eyes immediately scanning the printed text. The document was a crude generic template, likely downloaded directly from the internet. As a forensic accountant, I spot financial fraud for a living. I did not even need to run a deep analysis to see the glaring inconsistencies. The signature at the bottom of the page looked vaguely like Daniel's handwriting, but the pen pressure was completely wrong, and the ink seemed remarkably fresh for a document supposedly signed over 5 long months ago. Furthermore, the interest rate listed on the fake document violated state usury laws, something Daniel would have instantly recognized. They were currently standing in my quiet driveway, attempting to extort a grieving widow completely unaware that I had spent the last 5 months mapping out every single penny of Daniel's wealth. I stared down at the forged signature, feeling a cold, calculating surge of pure adrenaline pumping through my veins. The trap was officially set. My enemies had finally arrived. Let the brutal games begin. I slowly folded the crisp piece of paper exactly in half, creasing the edge, and held it out toward my mother. "I am not paying this," I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying over the gentle suburban breeze. "This is clearly not Daniel's signature. And even if it were, the interest rate you listed on this ridiculous document violates state usury laws. I will not give you a single cent." Patricia's jaw dropped in shock. She snatched the paper back so aggressively that her manicured nails scraped against my palm. "Excuse me," she hissed, her voice vibrating with raw anger. "How dare you speak to me with such blatant disrespect? I am your mother. You are nothing but a confused, grieving widow who clearly has absolutely no idea how to manage a complex financial portfolio. I will drag you through probate court until you are completely bankrupt and begging me for a place to stay." Ashley stepped forward instantly, positioning herself between me and our mother, aggressively invading my personal space. She pointed a long finger polished in red lacquer right at my chest. "You really want to play hardball with us, Cassidy?" She sneered, her designer sunglasses slipping slightly down the bridge of her nose. "Because we did not come here just to ask nicely. You pay Mom the $300,000 in cash right now, or she is filing an emergency petition for grandparents' rights first thing tomorrow morning. We already spoke to a very expensive family lawyer. We will file immediate injunctions to freeze Daniel's entire estate, drain your pathetic bank accounts with endless legal fees, and take the boy away from you. You are an unstable, depressed widow who had a traumatic birth. A family court judge will look at your psychological state and hand that child right over to his loving, wealthy, and emotionally stable grandmother." The sheer audacity of the threat hung heavily in the crisp air between us. Grandparents' rights, they did not even know his name. They had abandoned me to die in a sterile emergency room so they could drink vintage champagne in a Parisian hotel, and now they were actively using my infant son as a legal pawn to extort money. Most new mothers would have instantly collapsed in tears at the sheer terror of losing their child to a ruthless legal system. But I did not flinch. I knew the family law codes intimately. I knew that family court judges in our state required documented proof of a strong pre-existing bond to even consider granting visitation or custody rights to a grandparent. They had zero proof. They had never sent a baby gift, never made a single phone call, and never even looked at a photograph. They were arrogantly walking into a legal slaughterhouse entirely blind. I looked Ashley dead in the eyes and let out a short, genuine laugh that echoed loudly down the driveway. "You want to file a lawsuit against me?" I asked, raising a skeptical eyebrow. "You actually want to drag my husband's private estate into a public courtroom and open up a full financial discovery process?" I shifted my intense gaze directly to my mother, dropping my voice down to a sharp, icy whisper. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do that, Mom? Because once you file that legal petition, the judge is going to demand a thorough, exhaustive look at everyone's finances. Your offshore bank accounts, your credit scores, your tangible assets." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to Patricia, forcing her to look at me. "For instance, the court might want to verify the deed to your beautiful, sprawling colonial house, the one you love bragging about at the country club luncheons. Are you completely certain you want a judge pulling those public property records? Patricia's face went completely rigid. The color instantly drained from her cheeks, leaving her expensive designer foundation looking like a pale, ghostly mask. Her eyes darted nervously away from mine, and she swallowed hard, her throat visibly working. She knew I was implying something incredibly dangerous, even if she did not yet realize the full devastating extent of my knowledge. But Ashley, completely blind to the financial ruin hovering over her own head, just scoffed loudly. "Do not try to threaten Mom," she yelled, stomping her expensive heel. "Her house is worth almost $2 million and is fully paid off. You live in this pathetic, outdated ranch. You are nothing compared to our family." "If you are so confident," I replied. Turning back to my stroller, "Then I highly suggest you go file that paperwork tomorrow morning. But I promise you this. The moment you cross that courthouse threshold, your fake wealthy illusion officially ends." Just as the heavy silence settled over the driveway, a sleek charcoal gray Mercedes sedan pulled up to the curb, right behind my mother's obnoxious Range Rover. The driver's side door opened, and Andre stepped out into the afternoon sun. At 36 years old, Andre was a highly respected orthopedic surgeon, a brilliant Black American man with a commanding presence, impeccable manners, and an untarnished 820 credit score. He was still wearing his dark blue hospital scrubs under a tailored wool overcoat, having clearly just come off a long surgical shift. Unlike the two women standing on my lawn, Andre carried a beautifully wrapped gift box from a high-end children's boutique in his hands. He walked up the driveway with a warm, sympathetic expression, completely oblivious to the venomous extortion plot his wife and mother-in-law were currently executing. "Ashley, what are you doing here?" Andre asked, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "You told me you were going to the spa with Patricia. I tracked your phone location because you forgot your house keys on the kitchen counter." He turned his attention to me, his eyes softening with genuine sorrow. "Cassidy, I am so incredibly sorry for your loss. I wanted to come to the funeral, but Ashley told me it was a strictly private closed casket service for immediate blood relatives only. I brought this for my new nephew. It is a custom engraved silver rattle." I stared at Andre, my heart breaking slightly for him. He was a genuinely good man, trapped in a marriage built entirely on deceit. Ashley had lied to him about my husband's funeral just to keep him away from me. She knew that if Andre and I spoke, he might start asking questions about Daniel's finances. He might realize that the grieving widow standing in the driveway was completely capable of exposing the rot hiding beneath his wife's perfect exterior. Ashley instantly panicked. The smug, aggressive demeanor she had weaponized just moments ago completely vanished, replaced by a frantic, high-pitched, nervous energy. She lunged forward, physically blocking Andre from taking another step toward my stroller. She grabbed his arm, her manicured fingers digging into the fabric of his coat. "Andre, sweetheart, we were just leaving." Ashley stammered, her eyes darting wildly between her husband and me. "Cassidy is obviously still very unstable and emotional right now. We were just trying to offer our support, but she is being incredibly hostile. Let us just go home. Please, I am exhausted." Andre frowned, looking down at his wife in confusion. "Hostile, Ashley? She just lost her husband and had a baby. We should be helping her, not ambushing her in the driveway. Let me at least give her the gift." "No." Ashley snapped, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "I mean, I will give it to her later. Let us go grab a late lunch. My treat. I am starving." In her frantic rush to herd her husband back to his car, Ashley aggressively yanked her phone out of her crocodile skin handbag. As she did, a heavy, sleek black metal credit card slipped out of the side pocket and clattered loudly onto the concrete driveway. It landed face up directly between us, shining brightly in the afternoon sun. The world seemed to move in slow motion. I looked down at the card. It was a premium invite-only rewards card from a major international bank. I recognized the distinct logo instantly. It was the exact same account I had spent hours analyzing the night before. the account that currently carried a staggering $250,000 balance. The account Ashley had fraudulently opened using Andre's stolen social security number to fund her luxurious European vacations and expensive wardrobe. Andre glanced down at the concrete. "Oh, you dropped your card," he said casually, stepping forward to retrieve it. Ashley let out a terrified gasp. She practically dove onto the pavement, snatching the metal card with lightning speed before Andre could even read the name printed on the front. She shoved it deep into her coat pocket, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. "It is just an old gift card," she lied, her voice trembling slightly. "Come on, Andre, we are leaving right now. Get in the car." Andre looked at her, his brows furrowed in deep suspicion. He was a brilliant surgeon. He was not stupid. He could sense the erratic, desperate energy radiating off his wife, but he chose not to start a screaming match on his grieving sister-in-law's front lawn. He gave me a polite, apologetic nod, placed the baby gift gently on the hood of my car, and allowed Ashley to physically drag him away toward his Mercedes. Patricia practically ran back to her Range Rover, eager to escape before the situation unraveled any further. I stood perfectly still, watching their luxury vehicles speed away down the quiet suburban street. Ashley thought she had successfully dodged a bullet. She thought she had protected her luxurious web of lies. But as I looked at the silver rattle Andre had left behind, I smiled a cold, humorless smile. They had just given me everything I needed. I turned the stroller around and walked back into my house, picking up my phone to call my probate attorney. It was time to finally strike back. I walked into my quiet kitchen, locked the front door, and dialed Richard, my probate attorney. He answered on the second ring. I told him about the ambush in the driveway, the forged promissory note, and the panicked look on Ashley's face when her premium credit card hit the concrete. Richard chuckled a dry, raspy sound over the phone. He told me that desperate people make careless mistakes, and Patricia and Ashley were practically handing us the rope to hang them with. He advised me to stay completely silent and wait for their next move. They were arrogant, and arrogant people always need an audience. He was absolutely right. It only took them 4 hours to launch their public assault. Later that evening, after putting my son to sleep, my phone began vibrating continuously against the kitchen counter. It started with one text message from an aunt I had not spoken to in 3 years, then a barrage of notifications from Facebook, followed by a voicemail from my cousin. I unlocked my screen and opened the social media app. Right at the top of my feed was a massive multi-paragraph post, written by my mother Patricia. It already had hundreds of reactions, dozens of shares, and a rapidly growing comment section filled with outraged friends and extended family members. I read the post carefully, marveling at the sheer theatricality of her lies. Patricia had crafted a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She wrote about how her heart was completely shattered by the tragic loss of her beloved son-in-law, Daniel. She claimed they had a beautiful, close relationship and that he had confided in her about his failing software business just days before his fatal accident. Then the narrative took a vicious turn. Patricia painted herself as a desperate, loving grandmother who was being cruelly shut out by an unstable, deeply disturbed daughter. She wrote that the traumatic birth had completely broken my mental state. She claimed I was hoarding Daniel's remaining assets, refusing to honor a legal loan he had begged her for to save his company, and using my innocent infant son as a weapon of punishment. "I am terrified for my grandson's safety," she typed, ending the post with a string of crying emojis. "She is not in her right mind. She has blocked our numbers and threatened to call the police on me just for bringing a baby gift to her house today. Please pray for our family during this agonizing nightmare." It was a calculated, vicious smear campaign designed to destroy my reputation and build public sympathy for her upcoming lawsuit. And it was working perfectly. My phone was completely blowing up. Relatives who had not bothered to attend Daniel's funeral were suddenly deeply invested in my mental health. My aunt texted me, calling me a selfish monster for keeping a grieving grandmother away from her only grandchild. A cousin left a voicemail demanding I pay my mother back the money I supposedly stole. People from my mother's country club were leaving public comments tagging local family lawyers and suggesting Patricia call Child Protective Services on me. A normal person would have been devastated. A normal widow would have logged on crying and frantically typing out a desperate defense trying to explain the truth to people who had already made up their minds. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not type a single angry reply. I did not block anyone. Instead, I poured myself a cup of black tea, sat down at my kitchen island, and opened a fresh digital folder on my laptop. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously screenshotting every single post, every shared link, every vicious comment, and every hateful text message. I captured the timestamps, the usernames, and the exact wording of my mother's defamatory claims. Defamation is a very specific legal tort, and my mother was publicly accusing me of financial theft and child endangerment in writing. I cataloged the evidence with the cold, detached precision of a forensic accountant building a federal fraud case. I forwarded the entire encrypted digital file to Richard with a single clear sentence attached. "Here is the public defamation evidence you asked for." Richard replied less than 5 minutes later with a very enthusiastic response. "This is absolute gold, Cassidy. We are going to tear them apart in court." I closed my laptop and walked upstairs to quietly check on my sleeping son. My mother thought she was controlling the narrative. She thought she was isolating me, painting me into a corner where I would be forced to surrender out of pure public shame. She had absolutely no idea that her viral Facebook post was not a weapon against me. It was a completely legally binding public confession. Exactly 2 days after the viral social media post, the formal legal strike finally arrived at my doorstep. A courier knocked aggressively on my front door and handed me a thick manila envelope requiring a certified signature. I signed the electronic pad, took the envelope into my kitchen, and sliced it open with a paring knife. Inside was a formal demand letter, printed on the shockingly cheap thin letterhead of a strip mall family law attorney named Gary. My mother had clearly hired the cheapest, most aggressive lawyer she could find on short notice, someone willing to send threatening legal documents without doing even a basic background check on the estate. The letter was a masterpiece of sloppy legal intimidation. Gary formally demanded the immediate liquidation of $300,000 from Daniel's estate to satisfy the forged promissory note. Furthermore, he explicitly threatened to file an emergency injunction for grandparents' rights, citing my severe emotional instability and erratic behavior as the primary justifications. He actually referenced the defamatory Facebook post as evidence of my unfitness to parent. The letter concluded with a smug ultimatum, offering me the chance to settle the matter quickly in private mediation to avoid the public humiliation of a prolonged court battle. They were banking entirely on my supposed fragility. They assumed I would be too terrified of a public scandal to fight back. I placed the amateur demand letter on top of my 3 heavy color-coded forensic accounting binders. Then I picked up my phone, called my babysitter, and drove straight to the downtown financial district to meet with my probate attorney, Richard. Richard operated out of a sleek, glass-walled office on the 40th floor of a premier corporate law firm. He was a silver-haired legal veteran who had spent 30 years dismantling complex corporate fraud and protecting massive family estates. He did not deal with petty emotional squabbles. He dealt strictly in hard financial facts and ruthless litigation. I walked into his spacious office, dropped the 3 massive binders onto his polished mahogany desk, and handed him the demand letter from Gary. Richard adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the document. A slow, deeply amused smile spread across his weathered face. He tossed the letter onto the desk with a gesture of pure dismissal. "This attorney is completely out of his depth," Richard said, leaning back in his leather chair. "He is citing family law codes that were amended 4 years ago, and he is attempting to extort a private estate using a digital printout with a highly questionable signature. He wants to bully you into private mediation because he knows he does not have the actual evidence to survive a real courtroom trial. They want a quiet payout." I sat down in the chair opposite him and crossed my legs. "We are not giving them a quiet payout," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I want you to reject the offer for mediation immediately. We are taking this straight to probate court. I want everything entirely on the public record." Richard raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed by my absolute lack of hesitation. "You understand that going to court means all the financial discovery will become public knowledge," he warned gently. "It will expose everything Daniel was doing behind your back." I pushed the 3 heavy binders across the desk toward him. "That is exactly what I want," I replied. "Open the first binder." For the next hour, I walked my attorney through every single piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered. I showed him the property deed proving I was the legal owner of my mother's foreclosed mansion. I watched Richard's eyes widen as he reviewed the wire transfers Daniel had sent to Ashley. But the most devastating moment came when I opened the final binder and showed him the fraudulent credit card applications. I explained how Ashley had stolen her husband Andre's social security number to open premium accounts, committing a massive federal financial crime that Daniel had been secretly covering up. Richard closed the final binder and took a deep breath, looking at me with a mixture of professional awe and deep respect. "Cassidy," he said quietly, "this is not just a probate dispute anymore. You have handed me the loaded gun to completely obliterate their entire lives. If we present this evidence in open court, your mother will be immediately evicted and left entirely homeless. Your sister will not only face an ugly, catastrophic divorce from Andre, but the judge will be legally obligated to report her to the federal authorities for severe identity theft. They will lose absolutely everything." I looked out the massive glass window at the sprawling city below, thinking about the blinding pain of giving birth alone, while my mother and sister laughed in a luxury airport lounge. I thought about them showing up at my driveway, threatening to steal my infant son, just to maintain their fake glamorous lifestyle. "Draft the response, Richard," I said, turning back to look him directly in the eyes. "Tell them we reject their mediation offer. Tell them we will see them in court, and make sure you subpoena both of them to appear in person. I want to look at their faces when they realize they brought a knife to a gunfight." Richard smiled, a sharp, predatory smile. He pulled his keyboard toward him and began to type. The legal strike was officially authorized, and my mother was about to walk blindly into a devastating trap. 3 weeks later, I walked through the heavy bronze doors of the county courthouse. The morning air was crisp, but I felt entirely at peace. I was wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, holding my head high as my heels clicked against the polished marble floors. Richard walked right beside me, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of my remaining blood relatives. We bypassed the security checkpoint and made our way toward the probate division on the 3rd floor. I did not feel any anxiety. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. I was stepping onto my battlefield. When we stepped off the elevator, the long, echoing hallway was already buzzing with restless energy. I immediately spotted them standing near the wooden doors of courtroom 4. My mother was dressed in a dark designer dress, trying to play the part of a grieving, traumatized grandmother for anyone watching. Next to her stood Gary, the strip mall family attorney she had hired. He looked even less impressive than his letterhead, sweating slightly in a cheap, ill-fitting suit while frantically flipping through a thin folder. They looked exactly like people who had no idea they were walking into a slaughter. Then I saw Ashley. She was wearing a perfectly pressed black silk blouse and holding artisan coffee. The moment she saw me step out of the elevator, her eyes narrowed. She whispered something to our mother, and then broke away from her legal huddle. She marched straight down the hallway, cutting off my path to the courtroom entrance. Richard paused beside me, giving me a questioning look. I simply held up my hand, telling him to wait. I wanted to hear exactly what my sister had to say. Ashley stopped inches away, deliberately invading my personal space, just like she had done in my driveway weeks ago. She looked me up and down, taking in my professional attire with a distinct sneer of disapproval. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a harsh, toxic whisper, trying to frame her extortion as sisterly advice. "Listen to me carefully, Cassidy," she whispered, glancing around to make sure nobody else could hear her. Mom is extremely angry and Gary is ready to destroy your reputation in there. The judge is going to look at your medical records from the birth and declare you completely unfit to manage an estate. You will lose custody of your son, but it does not have to be this ugly. Just tell your lawyer to accept mediation right now. Quietly sell that pathetic ranch house of yours, pay Mom the $300,000, and we can all move on. Do not drag Daniel's private business into a public courtroom. You are going to embarrass his memory and ruin his legacy. Just surrender, Cassidy, because you cannot win this. She stared at me, waiting for my composure to crack. She expected my eyes to fill with tears. For 33 years, my sister had successfully gaslighted me, using shame and guilt to keep me perfectly obedient. But the woman standing in front of her today was not the younger sister she used to bully. I did not say a single word in response. I simply looked past her shoulder, focusing my gaze entirely on the man sitting quietly on a wooden bench further down the hallway. It was Andre. He was dressed in a pristine gray suit, reading a medical journal while waiting for the doors to open. He had taken time out of his demanding surgical schedule to come here and support his wife. He was a loyal husband, completely blind to the fact that his perfect marriage was built on massive federal fraud. My chest tightened with genuine pity for him. In less than an hour, the absolute worst moment of his life was going to unfold on public record, and I was the one pulling the trigger. But saving him from my sister's financial abuse was the only moral choice. I shifted my gaze back to Ashley. Her smug, confident smile slowly began to falter under my icy, unblinking stare. She shifted her weight nervously. "Are you even listening to me?" Ashley snapped, her voice rising slightly. "I am trying to save you from complete humiliation here." I stepped around her, closing the distance between us. "Save your breath, Ashley," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. "You are going to need it for the judge." Without giving her another second of my time, I walked right past her and joined Richard. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and the bailiff announced that the judge was ready to begin. I walked down the center aisle, took my seat at the solid defense table, and took a long, deep breath. The courtroom was vast, lined with dark oak paneling that swallowed the morning light filtering through the windows. I sat perfectly still beside Richard at the heavy defense table, meticulously folding my hands in my lap. Across the aisle at the plaintiff's table, my mother was already dabbing her completely dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing her tragic role perfectly before the judge even entered the room. Ashley sat directly behind them, her posture rigid and defensive, while Andre took a seat on the opposite side, keeping a respectful distance from the drama. A heavy silence fell over the room as the wooden door behind the bench finally opened. The bailiff instructed everyone to rise, and Judge Montgomery, a stern woman with sharp gray eyes and strict demeanor, took her seat. She adjusted her glasses, opened the thick case file, and officially called the session to order. This was a dual petition hearing, addressing the contested probate claim against my late husband's very large estate, and also the emergency injunction for forced grandparents' rights. Judge Montgomery directed her attention to Gary, asking for his opening arguments. Gary stood up, buttoning his cheap suit jacket, and walked to the podium. He cleared his throat loudly. "Your Honor," Gary began, his voice projecting a false confidence. "We are here today on behalf of my client, Patricia, a grieving mother and loving grandmother cruelly shut out of her family following a tragedy. We intend to prove the defendant, Cassidy, is suffering from severe emotional instability following her traumatic birth and the sudden loss of her husband. Furthermore, we will demonstrate the defendant is wrongfully withholding a legal debt of $300,000 owed to my client, a loan provided in good faith to save a failing business." Gary gestured wildly toward my table. "We are asking the court to immediately freeze the estate mandate supervised visitation for my client and enforce the legally binding promissory note." Judge Montgomery listened impassively, writing quick notes before telling Gary to call his first witness. Naturally, he called my mother. Patricia stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the wooden table as if she could barely support her weight. She walked toward the witness box with trembling steps, painting a picture of devastating heartbreak. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat down immediately, raising the handkerchief to her face. Gary approached the stand, adopting a soft tone. "Patricia," he said, "can you please tell the court about your relationship with your late son-in-law Daniel and your new grandson?" That was all it took. My mother unleashed an Oscar-worthy performance that would have fooled anyone who did not know her true nature. She began to sob hysterically, her shoulders shaking violently. "Daniel was like a son to me," Patricia wailed, her voice echoing. "We were incredibly close. When his software business started going bankrupt, he came to my house begging for help. He did not want Cassidy to know because she gets angry about money. I gave him my life savings because I loved him, and now she punished me by cutting me out. I have not seen my beautiful grandson in 5 months. I have a deep spiritual bond with that innocent little boy, Your Honor, and she is keeping him away from me out of pure greed." I sat watching her cry invisible tears over a baby she literally abandoned at the hospital while she flew first class to Paris. I did not react. Gary retrieved the crisp white paper from his folder and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "Your Honor," Gary announced proudly, "I am submitting Plaintiff Exhibit A into evidence. This is the $300,000 promissory note signed directly by Daniel himself just days before his fatal accident." Gary turned back to my mother. "Patricia, did you personally witness Daniel sign this legal document?" My mother nodded vigorously, clutching her hands against her chest. "Yes, I did," she cried, looking directly at the judge with wide, pleading eyes. "He sat at my kitchen table, signed it with a blue pen, and thanked me for saving his family. It is his absolute signature. I swear on my life and on my grandson's future." A murmur rippled through the gallery. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Andre looking at my mother with deep, genuine sympathy. He truly believed her heartbreaking story. He had absolutely no idea that every single word falling from her mouth was a deliberate, calculated perjury. Richard leaned over and whispered in my ear, "She just locked herself into a sworn lie under oath. We have her exactly where we want her, Cassidy." I gave a single cold nod in response. It was finally time to start the demolition. Richard slowly stood up from his chair at the defense table. He did not carry a single piece of paper or any notes. He did not raise his voice or attempt to match my mother's theatrical energy. Instead, he walked toward the center of the courtroom with the relaxed, effortless confidence of an apex predator that had just cornered its prey. Patricia sniffled loudly into her lace handkerchief, bracing herself for an aggressive attack, but Richard simply stopped a few feet away and smiled warmly at her. "Mrs. Patricia," Richard began, his voice smooth and incredibly conversational, "you have painted a very moving picture today of your profound love for your infant grandson. You are petitioning this honorable court for legally mandated visitation rights, claiming a deep spiritual bond that is being cruelly severed by my client." Patricia nodded bravely, dabbing the corners of her dry eyes. "Yes," she whispered softly. "That is all I want. I just want to see my sweet boy and hold him in my arms." "Understood," Richard said, pacing slowly in front of the witness box. "However, family court law in this state is very specific and very clear. To grant grandparents' rights over the explicit objection of a fit parent, the court must find that a substantial pre-existing relationship already exists between the grandparent and the child. Since you share such a profound and unbreakable bond, I have 3 very simple questions to establish that relationship for the official public record." Gary, the strip mall lawyer, shifted nervously in his cheap suit. He leaned forward, sensing a trap, but lacking the intellect to see exactly where it was hidden. "First," Richard said, stopping and looking directly into my mother's eyes, "please tell the court your grandson's exact date of birth." The massive courtroom fell completely silent. The heavy oak clock on the wall seemed to tick louder. Patricia completely froze. She slowly lowered the lace handkerchief from her face, her eyes darting frantically toward the plaintiff table where Ashley was sitting. But Ashley was suddenly staring down at her lap, refusing to make eye contact. "Well?" Patricia stammered, her voice rapidly, losing its theatrical tremble. It was in the spring, late April. The 22nd, I believe. The 22nd, Richard repeated flatly, not breaking eye contact. Your Honor, let the record show my client gave birth via emergency surgery on May the 3rd. Your client missed her beloved grandson's birthday by nearly 2 weeks. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Montgomery frowned deeply, making a sharp, aggressive note in her heavy case file. Patricia's face flushed a dark, ugly shade of red. Cassidy did not send me a formal birth announcement, she deflected defensively, gripping the wooden railing. She completely shut me out of the delivery room and refused to answer her phone. She was undergoing emergency surgery to save her life, while you were actively boarding a first-class flight to Paris. Richard countered instantly, his voice snapping through the air like a whip. But let us move on to the second question. Since you feel such a deep spiritual connection to this innocent child, could you please tell the court his full name? Specifically, his middle name. Patricia gripped the edges of the witness stand so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The confident, grieving grandmother facade was rapidly melting away, exposing the panicked, ignorant stranger underneath. His first name is Leo, she guessed confidently, as Ashley had likely pulled that basic information from a public baby registry months ago. And his middle name is Daniel, after his poor father. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my face an absolute mask of stone. Incorrect again, Richard said, shaking his head with mock sympathy. His middle name is Thomas, named after Daniel's late grandfather, a fact Daniel shared with you at Thanksgiving last year. So you do not know the day he was born, and you do not know his legal name. Objection! Gary shouted, practically jumping to his feet. Counsel is badgering the witness. My client has been maliciously alienated from the child. Overruled. Judge Montgomery snapped, her sharp gray eyes fixed entirely on my mother with growing disdain. The witness claimed a deep spiritual bond under oath. I want to hear the rest of this line of questioning. Sit down, counselor. Thank you, Your Honor, Richard said, turning back to Patricia. Just one final question regarding the child. Since you are asking this court to grant you unsupervised visitation and partial custody rights, it is absolutely vital that you understand his medical needs. What is the name of his primary pediatrician, and does the boy have any documented allergies? Patricia opened her mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. She looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. She looked at the stern judge, then at her sweating lawyer, and finally at me, her eyes flashing with pure, unadulterated hatred. I do not know, she finally hissed through clenched teeth. Richard turned his back to her and faced the judge directly. Your Honor, the plaintiff has completely failed to establish even the most basic fundamental facts about the child she claims to love so deeply. She does not know his birthday. She does not know his name. She does not know his doctor. The legal standard for grandparents' rights requires an existing substantial bond. Patricia has absolutely no bond with this child. She is a total stranger to him. Judge Montgomery looked down at Patricia with undisguised disgust. I am inclined to agree, Counselor, the judge said sharply. The custody portion of this petition is entirely baseless. Move on to the financial claims. I glanced over my shoulder at Andre sitting in the gallery. He was leaning forward, his brow deeply furrowed in confusion and growing alarm. The tragic story he had been fed by his wife was rapidly unraveling before his very eyes. Now, Richard said, pivoting sharply back to the witness stand. The warm tone was completely gone, replaced by the lethal edge of a seasoned litigator. Let us discuss the $300,000 promissory note. You testified under penalty of perjury that you personally witnessed Daniel sign this document. Patricia swallowed hard, clinging desperately to her last remaining lie. Yes, I did. Excellent, Richard said, picking up my heavy blue forensic accounting binder. Because my client happens to be a licensed forensic accountant, and we have some very interesting digital metadata to share with the court regarding this exact piece of paper, Your Honor. Richard continued, turning back to the bench. Given the highly complex financial nature of this estate, I call my client Cassidy to the stand, not merely as the defendant, but as an officially sworn expert witness in forensic accounting. Gary practically leaped over his table. "Objection!" he yelled, waving his hands frantically. "Massive conflict of interest, Your Honor. She is the sole beneficiary of the estate. She cannot testify as an unbiased financial expert in her own civil trial." Judge Montgomery glared down at him. "She is a licensed corporate auditor and the legal executor of this estate counselor. She is perfectly qualified to testify on the financial records she personally managed and inherited." Overruled. "The witness will take the stand." I stood up from the defense table. I smoothed down the jacket of my charcoal suit and walked toward the witness box with measured, deliberate steps. I placed my right hand on the Bible, swore to tell the absolute truth, and took my seat. I looked directly across the room at the plaintiff table. My mother and sister were exchanging highly confused, nervous glances. For my entire life, they had viewed my career as boring, mocking me for crunching numbers while they attended luxury parties and lived glamorous lives. They lacked the intellectual capacity to understand that a forensic accountant is essentially a financial homicide detective. They were about to realize far too late that they had wandered blindly into the territory of an apex predator. Richard approached the stand and handed me the heavy blue binder. "Cassidy," he said smoothly, "let us discuss Plaintiff Exhibit A, the promissory note. Did your late husband sign this document?" "No," I replied, my voice projecting clearly across the silent courtroom. "He did not." "This document is a complete forgery." Gary scoffed loudly from his table. "Your Honor, she is just making wild accusations to avoid paying her mother." I opened the binder and pulled out a stack of enlarged high-resolution printouts. I handed them to the bailiff, who distributed copies to the judge and the opposing counsel. Then I pressed a button on the witness stand console, projecting the primary document onto the large digital monitors mounted around the courtroom. "What you are looking at on the screens," I explained calmly, looking directly at Judge Montgomery, "is the embedded digital metadata extracted from the original file of that exact promissory note. Every digital document leaves an invisible forensic fingerprint. It records exactly when a file was created, when it was modified, and the specific device used to author it." I picked up my laser pointer and aimed it at the screen, highlighting a string of digital timestamps. "As you can clearly see on line 4, this specific document was not created 5 months ago, before my husband passed away. It was created exactly 4 days after his fatal car accident. Specifically, it was authored on a Thursday afternoon at 2:14 p.m. The courtroom was dead silent. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Patricia was staring at the monitor, her mouth slightly open, completely failing to comprehend the digital code on the screen. But Ashley understood. The color was rapidly draining from her face, leaving her looking completely sick. Furthermore, I continued, my voice echoing with lethal precision. "The metadata reveals the exact machine used to draft this forgery. It was not typed on my husband's office computer. It was authored on a device with a registered user profile named Ashley Mac Pro. And the IP address logged at the exact moment of creation matches the guest network router at my personal home." I turned my head and looked directly at my sister. Ashley was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles were completely white. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving under her black silk blouse. "My sister Ashley," I stated firmly, "for the official court record, came to my house 4 days after Daniel died. She claimed she was coming over to help me organize the funeral arrangements while I was recovering from an emergency surgery. Instead, she sat at my kitchen island, logged onto my wireless network, and used her personal laptop to forge a $300,000 legal document against a dead man's estate." Gary physically dropped his expensive fountain pen. It hit the wooden table with a loud, hollow clatter. He looked at his clients with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. He realized instantly that his clients had not just lied to him. They had weaponized him to commit federal fraud in front of a sitting judge. Judge Montgomery slowly took off her reading glasses. She looked from the metadata printout directly to my sister. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy. Ashley, realizing the walls were completely closing in, looked frantically toward the gallery. She looked at her husband, Andre. Andre was not looking at her with sympathy anymore. The brilliant, highly respected surgeon was staring at his wife with an expression of absolute horror and disgust. He was a man of logic and science, and the digital evidence displayed on the courtroom monitors was completely irrefutable. My sister was a criminal, and I was just getting started. Judge Montgomery leaned back in her high leather chair, her expression darkening into a storm of judicial fury. She ordered the bailiff to securely retain the metadata printouts as official court evidence. Gary, my mother's attorney, was physically shaking at his table. He knew his legal career was hanging by a thread for submitting a forged document into a court of law. But I was not finished. I had promised my lawyer that we were going to obliterate their entire lives, and I fully intended to keep that promise. I turned my attention away from my hyperventilating sister and looked directly at my mother. Patricia was completely frozen. She had just watched her golden child get exposed for federal identity theft, and she could sense the crosshairs locking onto her. "Your Honor," I said, making sure my voice carried clearly to every corner of the gallery. "Since the plaintiff has brought my late husband's estate into question, and since she is claiming a desperate financial need due to this unpaid loan, I believe it is highly relevant for the court to understand her true financial standing." Gary tried to stand up his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "Objection, Your Honor. My client's personal finances are not the subject of this hearing." Judge Montgomery slammed her gavel down so hard, the sound echoed like a gunshot. "Sit down, Mr. Gary," she commanded fiercely. "Your client is attempting to extract $300,000 from an estate using a forged document. Her financial standing is incredibly relevant. The witness may proceed." I opened my second binder and pulled out a stack of certified county property records. I handed them to the bailiff. "My mother," I explained calmly to the court, "loves to present herself as a woman of immense wealth and high social standing. She frequently brags about her $1.5 million colonial home in the most exclusive suburban neighborhood in our city. She claims my husband was a struggling, desperate tech worker who came to her for a financial bailout. The reality is exactly the opposite." I pressed the button on my console, replacing the digital metadata on the screens with a scanned copy of a property deed and a bank foreclosure notice. 7 years ago, my mother defaulted completely on her massive mortgage. She was secretly bankrupt and about to be forcefully evicted by the bank. She was terrified of the public humiliation at her country club. So she went to the man she secretly despised. She begged Daniel for help. Patricia let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She slumped forward in her chair, burying her face in her hands. The wealthy, aristocratic facade she had spent decades carefully cultivating was being brutally ripped away in front of a gallery full of strangers. Daniel was too generous for his own good. I continued, my voice unwavering. He did not want me to know about her financial ruin, so he secretly formed a limited liability company registered in Delaware. He used his own liquid capital through that LLC to purchase the banknote outright, effectively saving her from foreclosure. My mother has been living in that massive colonial house completely rent-free for 7 years. Daniel paid the property taxes. Daniel paid the maintenance. She contributed absolutely nothing. I pulled one final document from the binder. It was printed on heavy official legal paper with a bright red county seal stamped at the bottom. "Since I am the sole legal beneficiary of Daniel's entire estate," I explained, "I am now the sole owner of that limited liability company, which means I own the deed to the property located at 400 Oak Creek Drive. I am officially my mother's landlord." I stepped out of the witness box. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the sound of my heels clicking on the floor. I walked directly over to the plaintiff table. Patricia looked up at me, her eyes completely wide with pure, unadulterated terror. The arrogant woman who had told me to call an Uber from my deathbed was completely gone. She was just a broke, desperate tenant staring at the owner of her home. I slid the heavy legal document across the oak table until it rested directly in front of her trembling hands. This is a formal court-authorized 30-day notice of eviction, I said, speaking loud enough for the microphone to pick up every single syllable. You have taken advantage of my husband's kindness for the very last time. You have 30 days to pack your designer clothes and vacate my property. If you leave a single scratch on the hardwood floors, I will sue you for property damage. Patricia completely broke down. She began sobbing loudly, ugly, gasping cries that echoed off the high ceiling. It was not a theatrical performance this time. It was the sound of a woman realizing her entire fake empire had just crumbled into dust. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, begging me to stop, begging me not to make her homeless. I simply pulled my hand back, turned around, and walked confidently back to the defense table. Richard gave me a slow, deeply satisfied nod. The first payload had been delivered flawlessly. The eviction was public. The embarrassment was absolute. And yet the most devastating blow of the day had not even landed yet. The courtroom was completely silent, except for my mother's quiet, broken sobbing. She sat slumped over the plaintiff table, her head resting near the eviction notice that had just stripped her of her home and her dignity. But Judge Montgomery was not interested in tears. Her sharp gray eyes shifted from the weeping woman back to Gary, the sweating strip mall attorney. The judge tapped her pen against the heavy mahogany bench, the sharp sound echoing through the room. "We are not finished here," Judge Montgomery announced, her voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "The court has just established that the plaintiff, Patricia, has been living in a property owned by the estate she is currently attempting to sue. But that does not address the core of her financial claim. Mr. Gary, your client submitted a promissory note for $300,000. A note the defense expert witness just testified is a complete forgery created after the deceased passed away." Gary stood up on completely shaky legs. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly, "I was completely unaware of any metadata. My clients presented this document to me in good faith. I am simply representing their claims to the best of my ability." The judge narrowed her eyes. "Do not try to backpedal now, counselor. You submitted this document into evidence. Let us hear the defense fully explain their findings. Cassidy, you may remain at the defense table. Please walk the court through the exact timeline of this document." I stood up straight, my charcoal suit perfectly unwrinkled, and opened my laptop right on the defense table. I did not need to return to the witness box. I had absolute command of the room. I connected my laptop to the courtroom monitor system and brought up a highly detailed color-coded timeline. "Thank you, Your Honor," I said clearly. 3 weeks ago, my mother and sister ambushed me in my driveway and demanded $300,000. They aggressively shoved a physical copy of this promissory note in my face. As a forensic accountant, I immediately noticed the signature did not match Daniel's typical pen pressure, and the interest rate was completely illegal under state usury laws. So I went back to my home office and began running a deep system check on Daniel's private servers. I clicked my mouse, and a complex web of digital directories appeared on the large screens. Daniel was a brilliant software engineer, I explained. He ran his entire life through encrypted servers located in our basement. He backed up every single document, every email, and every network connection that occurred on our property. When Ashley connected her personal laptop to our guest wireless network 4 days after Daniel died, the server automatically logged her activity. I highlighted a specific row of data on the screen. Ashley assumed she was being clever. She downloaded a generic legal template from a free internet site. She filled in my mother's name, Daniel's name, and the amount of $300,000. Then she digitally pasted an old image of Daniel's signature from a previous unrelated tax document at the bottom of the page. She printed it out using my home office printer. The ink was barely dry when she handed it to my mother. I turned to look directly at Ashley. She was practically shrinking into her chair, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently. She looked absolutely terrified. "This is not a simple civil dispute over a family loan," I stated, looking back to the judge. "This is a deliberate, calculated act of felony forgery. My sister and my mother conspired to manufacture a fake legal document to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars from a grieving widow. They assumed I would be too depressed and too distracted by my newborn son to verify the paperwork. They thought they could bully me into a quick settlement. Ashley suddenly jumped out of her chair. "It was not my idea," she screamed hysterically, her perfectly polished facade completely shattering. Her voice echoed wildly off the high ceilings. "Mom told me to do it. Mom said Daniel owed her for always treating her so poorly. Mom said you were too stupid to figure it out. I did not want to do it." Patricia lifted her head from the table, looking at her golden child in absolute shock. "Ashley, how could you say that?" My mother gasped, fresh tears streaming down her face. "You were the one who needed the money." "Order in my courtroom," Judge Montgomery roared, slamming her gavel down repeatedly. "Both of you sit down and shut your mouths right now, or I will have the bailiffs throw you in holding cells for contempt." Ashley immediately collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her hands. Gary looked like he was about to pass out. He began furiously packing his thin legal folders into his cheap briefcase, clearly realizing his career was essentially over. The judge turned her furious gaze toward the plaintiff table. "So it is admitted on the record," Judge Montgomery said, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. "The document is forged. The claim is entirely fraudulent. Not only will I dismiss this lawsuit with extreme prejudice, but I will be forwarding this entire court transcript and the metadata evidence directly to the district attorney's office. You two are going to face severe criminal charges for this." I stood perfectly still, watching my enemies completely self-destruct. It was a beautiful, chaotic moment of pure justice, but the destruction was not quite complete. There was still one massive secret left to expose. One final blow that would completely obliterate my sister's luxurious fake life forever. I closed the timeline on my laptop and prepared to open the final, most devastating file. I opened the final file directory on my screen. The heavy silence in the courtroom was thick enough to choke on. My mother was still weeping softly at the plaintiff table, her face buried in her hands, while my sister Ashley sat completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the polished wood in front of her. Judge Montgomery watched me intently, her wooden gavel resting lightly in her hand, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle. I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs, and stepped out from behind the heavy defense table. I did not look at the judge this time. I did not look at my mother. I turned my body and focused my gaze entirely on the wooden benches of the public gallery. I looked directly at Andre. He was sitting completely still, his broad shoulders tense beneath his tailored gray suit. His expression was a volatile mix of profound confusion and growing horror. He had come to this courthouse to support his wife, believing she was the innocent victim of a greedy, unstable widow. Now he was watching the woman he loved be exposed as a desperate federal criminal. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my eyes locked on my brother-in-law, "we have clearly established that the $300,000 promissory note was a complete fabrication. But a forensic accountant does not just look at how a crime was committed. We look at the core motive. We follow the money to understand exactly why the crime was necessary in the first place. Why did my sister need $300,000 so desperately that she was willing to risk federal prison to get it?" I walked slowly toward the gallery railing, closing the physical distance between myself and Andre. I felt a genuine pang of sorrow for the man. He was a brilliant orthopedic surgeon. He spent his long days repairing shattered bones and saving lives. He operated with absolute unwavering integrity. He paid his taxes on time. He maintained an impeccable 820 credit score, and he provided his wife with a beautiful, comfortable life. He did not deserve the utter devastation that was about to rain down on his head. Ashley did not forge that document because Daniel owed her money. I stated clearly, my voice carrying a heavy, sorrowful weight. She forged it because she was trying to replace the money she had already stolen. She was running out of time, and the banks were threatening to expose her secret. I raised my remote control and clicked the button. The large digital monitors above the judge's bench shifted instantly. The forged promissory note disappeared, replaced by a massive color-coded spreadsheet detailing a series of high-interest offshore personal loans and premium credit card statements. "Andre," I said, addressing him directly for the very first time today, "I am so incredibly sorry to be the one to tell you this. But your wife did not want this money for my late husband. She needed the $300,000 to cover up the $250,000 in secret offshore loans she took out using your stolen identity." A collective audible gasp echoed through the courtroom. Even Judge Montgomery leaned forward, her eyes widening behind her wire-rimmed glasses. Andre physically recoiled as if he had just been struck violently in the chest. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting from my face up to the glowing monitors. I pressed the button again, bringing up the scanned copies of the original credit applications. There, in bold black ink, was Andre's full legal name, his exact date of birth, his medical license number, and his pristine social security number. But the signature at the bottom of the applications was a clumsy, rushed imitation of his actual handwriting. "Ashley knew you would never approve of her reckless spending," I explained, my voice echoing relentlessly against the oak paneling. "She wanted luxury vacations to Paris. She wanted designer wardrobes, expensive spa treatments, and a lifestyle to impress her country club friends. When you refused to fund her financial delusions, she simply bypassed you. She stole your social security number from your private home office files. She opened massive lines of credit under your name, intercepting the physical mail and routing all digital correspondence to a hidden email account you knew nothing about." I pointed to the staggering balances displayed in bright red numbers on the screen. Over the past 3 years, Ashley has accumulated $250,000 in high-interest debt. The interest alone was drowning her. Daniel discovered her massive fraud shortly before he died. He was quietly using his own money to make the minimum monthly payments, trying to give her time to come clean to you without destroying your medical career and your flawless financial standing. But when Daniel died, her secret safety net completely vanished. The creditors started calling. She panicked entirely. So she targeted my husband's estate, hoping to extract a lump sum large enough to pay off the fraudulent loans before you ever found out the truth. I lowered the remote control and stepped back. Andre was staring at the screen, his face completely ashen. He was a man who built his entire life on precision, trust, and hard work. Now the irrefutable digital evidence was shining down on him, proving that the woman he shared a bed with had systematically destroyed his financial identity. He slowly turned his head away from the monitors and looked down at the plaintiff table. He looked directly at his wife. Ashley was shrinking under his intense gaze, tears of absolute panic ruining her expensive makeup. She had nowhere left to hide. The ultimate betrayal had just been dragged completely into the light. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, a suffocating quiet that pressed against the walls. Everyone was watching the golden child of our family finally face the consequences of her own horrific actions. I pressed the forward arrow on my laptop, and the screen transitioned to an itemized list of specific transactions from the fraudulent accounts. The numbers were staggering, but it was the specific line items that truly painted the picture of my sister's deep deception. I directed my laser pointer to a block of charges dated just 2 months ago. "Here's the $12,000 charge for the first-class airline tickets to Paris," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. The exact same trip my mother and sister prioritized over coming to the hospital the night I gave birth. Below that, we have the nightly charges for the Ritz Hotel suite, the daily shopping sprees at luxury boutiques along the Champs-Élysées, and thousands of dollars in fine dining. All of it funded by a credit line secured by Andre's stolen identity. Ashley let out a sharp, pathetic wail. She pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping violently against the floor, and turned her entire body toward the gallery. "Andre, please," she begged, her voice high and trembling. "Please do not look at those screens. It is not what it looks like. I can explain everything to you. I was going to tell you, I swear I was. You have to believe me." Andre did not move. He did not blink. He just stared at her with an expression of cold, terrifying emptiness. The man who had taken vows to love and protect her was realizing that the woman standing in front of him was an absolute stranger. I clicked the mouse again, bringing up another page of detailed bank statements. I was not going to let her spin a web of excuses. She did not just fund her own glamorous lifestyle. I continued speaking directly to the judge now. She was actively funding our mother's fake wealth as well. Here are the monthly lease payments for Patricia's Range Rover, automatically deducted from a fraudulent account. Here are the payments for Patricia's country club membership, her weekly spa appointments, and her expensive designer clothing. My sister systematically drained hundreds of thousands of dollars of illegal credit to maintain an illusion of suburban royalty for both of them. Gary, the strip mall lawyer, had completely given up any pretense of defending his clients. He was sitting with his arms crossed, staring down at his legal pad, actively trying to distance himself from the two felons sitting at his table. He knew the evidence presented was so overwhelming and irrefutable that any attempt to object would only anger the judge further. "Your Honor," I said, maintaining my professional composure. When Daniel realized the massive extent of this financial crime, he was horrified. He knew that if these defaults were reported to the credit bureaus, Andre's medical career could be severely jeopardized. A sudden, massive drop in a credit score of that magnitude can trigger immediate reviews by hospital boards and insurance providers. Daniel stepped in to make the minimum payments with his own money, effectively shielding Andre from the fallout, while giving Ashley an ultimatum to come clean to her husband. Ashley covered her face with her trembling hands, her shoulders shaking violently as she sobbed. She was completely unraveled. The golden child, the sister who had always looked down on me, who had mocked my practical career and my quiet life, was utterly destroyed. But instead of coming clean, I concluded, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving tone. When Daniel passed away, she chose to commit another felony. She forged the promissory note to steal $300,000 from a grieving widow and an infant child, all to save herself from the consequences of her original crime. She tried to use my dead husband's estate as a giant rug to sweep her federal crimes under. I turned off the digital projector. The screens above the judge's bench went completely black, plunging the visual focus back onto the people in the room. I walked calmly back to the defense table and sat down next to Richard. He gave me a look of absolute professional reverence. The forensic accounting demolition was officially complete. Every single lie had been exposed with ironclad proof. Judge Montgomery slowly organized the physical printouts I had submitted into a neat pile on her bench. She looked down at Ashley with an expression of pure judicial disgust. She did not see a glamorous, wealthy suburban housewife. She saw a calculated, remorseless criminal who had violated the most sacred trusts of both her family and the financial laws of the country. Ashley was still crying hysterically, reaching her hand out toward the gallery. "Andre, please say something," she pleaded, her voice breaking into a pathetic whisper. "Please help me." The entire courtroom turned their attention to the brilliant orthopedic surgeon sitting alone in the wooden pews. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The devastating evidence had been laid bare, and now it was time for the victim of this massive identity theft to make his move. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom seemed to hold the breath of everyone inside. Andre slowly stood up from the hard wooden bench in the gallery. He did not rush. He did not shout or lose his composure. As a surgeon, his entire life was built on remaining calm under immense life-threatening pressure. This moment was no different, even though his own life was the one bleeding out on the table. He buttoned the center button of his tailored suit jacket, his face an impenetrable mask of stoic resolve, and stepped out into the center aisle. Ashley let out a desperate guttural sob. "Andre, please talk to me," she begged, practically crawling out of her seat at the plaintiff table. "Let us go outside. Let us go home and fix this." Andre completely ignored her frantic pleas. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps down the aisle, his highly polished shoes echoing in the dead silence of the room. He bypassed the plaintiff table entirely, not even giving his wife a passing glance. Instead, he walked directly toward the wooden divider that separated the gallery from the legal floor. He opened the small swinging gate and stepped into the official well of the courtroom, an area strictly reserved for the lawyers and the actively involved parties. Judge Montgomery did not reprimand him for crossing the barrier. She simply watched, understanding the profound gravity of what this man was processing. Andre walked straight over to the defense table where Richard and I were sitting. He stopped right in front of my laptop. "May I look closer?" he asked, his deep voice remarkably steady, betraying absolutely no emotion. I nodded once and turned the screen slightly toward him. Andre leaned over the heavy oak table. He spent a long, agonizing minute reading the itemized credit card statements, the forged digital signatures, and the overwhelming balances of the offshore loans. He was scientifically verifying the absolute death of his marriage. He traced the line of a $12,000 charge to Paris, his jaw clenching so tightly I could see the muscles feathering beneath his skin. He stood up straight, letting out a slow, controlled exhale. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was finally cemented in his mind. For years he had worked exhausting 80-hour shifts at the hospital to provide a beautiful life for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than an exploitable social security number. Ashley had not just stolen his money. She had stolen his identity, compromised his professional reputation, and lied to him every single morning when she kissed him goodbye. The foundation of his reality was completely gone. He turned his body to face the plaintiff table where Ashley was now weeping so hard she was physically gasping for air. Andre raised his left hand. He looked down at the heavy gold wedding band resting on his ring finger. It was a symbol of trust, of partnership, of a sacred vow he had kept with absolute honor. Without a single trace of hesitation, he grasped the gold band with his right hand and slowly pulled it over his knuckle. The metal scraped softly against his skin in the quiet room. He did not throw the ring at her. He did not toss it away in a fit of rage. He simply reached out and placed the gold band deliberately on the edge of the defense table, right next to the massive binder of financial evidence that had just destroyed his life. It was a clinical, precise amputation of a toxic limb. "My lawyers will contact you," Andre said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a chilling, absolute finality that echoed off the high ceiling. "Do not call my phone. Do not contact my colleagues, and do not come back to my house. The locks will be changed by the time you leave this building. You are completely on your own." Ashley screamed his name, a harrowing sound of pure defeat, but Andre had already turned his back on her. He had drawn an unbreakable line in the sand. Before he walked away, Andre looked down at me. The betrayal in his eyes was heavily mixed with a profound unspoken gratitude. He gave me a slow, respectful nod, acknowledging the painful truth I had uncovered to save him. I nodded back, maintaining my complete silence. Andre turned around, walked steadily down the center aisle, and exited the courtroom without ever looking back. The heavy bronze doors clicked firmly shut behind him, sealing my sister inside her own nightmare. She had gambled everything she possessed on her sheer arrogance, and now she was left with absolutely nothing. Her golden child status meant nothing anymore. It was all over. Her entire world was completely obliterated. The heavy bronze doors clicked firmly shut behind Andre, sealing my sister inside her own nightmare. The sharp echo of the latch dropping into place was the final nail in the coffin of her perfect suburban life. For a long moment, nobody in the courtroom dared to speak. The air was incredibly thick, charged with the devastating electricity of the revelations that had just unfolded. Ashley remained slumped in her wooden chair, her chest heaving with erratic, panicked breaths, while my mother stared blankly at the polished table, completely paralyzed by the sheer velocity of their downfall. Judge Montgomery broke the heavy silence. She did not use her wooden gavel. She simply leaned forward, resting her forearms on the elevated mahogany bench, and fixed her sharp gray eyes on the plaintiff table. Her expression had hardened into a mask of absolute unforgiving judicial fury. She was a woman who respected the sanctity of the law above all else, and she had just witnessed two arrogant women attempt to turn her courtroom into an instrument of extortion. "Mr. Gary the judge," said her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet lethal register, "I highly suggest you choose your next words with extreme caution. You are currently standing at the edge of a massive ethical cliff, and you are holding the hands of two individuals who have just committed perjury and submitted forged documents into a federal record." Gary shot out of his chair as if the wood had suddenly caught fire. He was sweating profusely, his face drained of all color. "Your Honor," he stammered, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his legal pad. "I formally request to withdraw as legal counsel for both Patricia and Ashley immediately. I was intentionally misled. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of the metadata, the forgery, or the severe identity theft involved in this matter." Judge Montgomery stared him down for a long, agonizing moment. "Request granted," she snapped sharply. "Step away from that table, counselor. But let the record show that I will be forwarding a full transcript of this hearing to the State Bar Association. Your failure to perform basic due diligence on a fraudulent claim has wasted the valuable time of this court." Gary did not argue. He blindly stuffed his files into his cheap briefcase, turned on his heel, and practically sprinted out of the courtroom. He left his former clients sitting completely alone at the plaintiff table. They were isolated, defenseless, and entirely exposed. Judge Montgomery turned her lethal attention directly to my mother and sister. "In my 22 years sitting on this bench," she began, her voice ringing with absolute authority, "I have rarely witnessed such a sickening display of greed and malicious intent. You brought a grieving widow into my courtroom. You attempted to use the sacred concept of grandparents' rights to weaponize an innocent infant child. You attempted to extort $300,000 from a deceased man's estate using a clumsily forged document." Patricia let out a pathetic whimper, sinking lower into her chair, but the judge raised her hand, silencing her instantly. "I am not finished," Judge Montgomery roared. "Due to the overwhelming and irrefutable forensic evidence provided by the defense today, I am dismissing this entire civil lawsuit with extreme prejudice. That means you are permanently barred from ever filing these claims again in any court of law. You will receive absolutely nothing from this estate. Furthermore, you are hereby ordered to pay all of the defendant's legal fees and court costs." Ashley buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable sobs. But the civil dismissal was merely the beginning of their punishment. The judge reached for her heavy pen, her eyes narrowing as she looked directly at my sister. "The civil matter is closed," the judge stated coldly, "but the criminal matter is just beginning. Ashley, the digital evidence clearly demonstrates that you committed federal wire fraud and severe identity theft. You stole your husband's social security number, forged his signature on financial applications, and crossed state lines using fraudulently obtained funds. And then you walked into my courtroom and committed felony forgery and perjury to cover up those crimes." The judge turned to the court clerk sitting below the bench. "Impound all the digital metadata, the forensic accounting binders, and the bank statements immediately," she ordered. "I am formally referring this entire case directly to the District Attorney's Office and the Federal Fraud Division. I am signing a direct order for a criminal investigation into both Ashley and Patricia for conspiracy to commit fraud." Ashley screamed a raw, terrifying sound of complete destruction, but the judge simply struck her gavel against the sounding block with a deafening crack. "We are adjourned," she declared. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, watching the bailiffs approach the plaintiff table to formally seize the forged documents. I checked my silver watch. Exactly 45 minutes had passed since the bailiff first called the courtroom to order. 45 minutes. That was all it took to completely obliterate their toxic empire. My mother had walked into this building expecting a massive payout, and she was leaving it as a homeless, disgraced tenant facing severe criminal conspiracy charges. My sister had walked in as a wealthy, arrogant housewife, and she was leaving completely abandoned by her husband, stripped of her stolen wealth, and staring down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. They had absolutely nothing left. The slaughter was finally complete. I stood up from the heavy oak table as the bailiffs moved toward the plaintiff's side. Richard closed his leather briefcase with a satisfying click. He turned to me and offered a rare, genuine smile. "We did exactly what we came here to do," he said quietly. "Let us get out of here." I nodded, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. I did not look back at the table where my mother and sister were being held for questioning. I walked down the center aisle with my head held high, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. I pushed open the heavy bronze doors and stepped out into the bright hallway. The air outside the courtroom felt instantly lighter. We walked in companionable silence toward the elevators, the chaotic sounds of my former family fading away behind the thick wooden walls. The elevator ride down was swift. I watched the digital numbers count down, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my body. I had protected Daniel's legacy, secured my son's future, and surgically removed the toxic infection that plagued my life. The elevator chimed softly, and the steel doors slid open. We walked through the bustling lobby and pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors, stepping out onto the massive concrete steps. The crisp afternoon air hit my face, smelling like absolute freedom. The sun was shining brightly, casting long shadows across the concrete. Richard stopped at the top of the steps and extended his hand toward me. "It has been an absolute privilege representing you, Cassidy," he said, his voice filled with deep professional respect. "You are one of the most formidable clients I have ever worked with. The eviction enforcement will be processed by the sheriff tomorrow morning, and I will monitor the federal fraud referrals closely. Go home to your son. You have won the war." I shook his hand firmly, thanking him for his brilliant execution of our strategy. Richard turned and walked down the steps toward the parking garage, leaving me standing alone in the afternoon sun. I took a deep breath, preparing to walk to my own car, when the heavy glass doors behind me violently burst open. I turned around slowly. My mother, Patricia, stumbled out onto the concrete landing. She looked absolutely horrific. Her expensive designer dress was violently wrinkled, and her perfect blowout was completely ruined, strands of hair sticking wildly to her tear-stained face. Her luxury mascara had run down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, making her look like a hollow, terrified ghost. The aristocratic, untouchable suburban queen was completely dead, replaced by a desperate, panicked woman who had just realized she was entirely out of options. She saw me standing at the top of the steps and practically lunged forward, her expensive heels scraping awkwardly against the stone. "Cassidy, wait!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with genuine terror. She threw herself toward me aggressively, grabbing my right forearm with both of her trembling hands. Her manicured nails dug sharply into the fabric of my suit jacket. She was weeping hysterically, gasping for air between her desperate broken sentences. "Cassidy, please," she begged, her eyes wide and wild. "You cannot do this to me. I am your mother. I gave birth to you. I raised you. You cannot just throw me out onto the street like a stray dog. I have absolutely nowhere else to go. All my money is completely gone. My friends at the country club will completely shun me if they find out about the foreclosure. Please, Cassidy, have some mercy. I will do anything you want. Just retract the eviction notice. Please do not make me homeless." I stood perfectly still, letting her tears fall onto the sleeve of my jacket. I looked down at her hands gripping my arm, and then I looked directly into her terrified, bloodshot eyes. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no lingering attachment. The woman sobbing in front of me was the exact same woman who had laughed in a luxury airport terminal while I was bleeding out on a hospital bed. I reached over with my left hand and slowly peeled her trembling fingers off my arm. I pushed her hands away, stepping back to re-establish my physical boundary. I looked at her with ice running through my veins. "Just call an Uber, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly flat. "Paris cannot wait." I turned my back on her and calmly walked down the massive courthouse steps. Her agonizing screams echoed across the wide concrete plaza, but I did not stop walking. I did not ever look over my shoulder to see her fall. I walked directly to my parked car, got inside and drove far away into the bright afternoon. I drove far away into the bright and peaceful afternoon, leaving the courthouse and my toxic family completely behind me forever. The weeks that followed moved with a brutal mechanical efficiency. The legal machinery we set into motion during that 45-minute hearing did not slow down or show any mercy. Richard promised that the eviction enforcement would be processed immediately, and the county sheriff department did not disappoint. Exactly 30 days after the judge issued the order, a pair of black and white police cruisers pulled up to the sprawling colonial mansion on Oak Creek Drive. The house that had served as my mother's fortress of arrogance for the past 7 years was finally falling. I was not there to watch it happen, but the real estate agent I hired to manage the property sale sent me a highly detailed report. Deputies knocked on the heavy mahogany front door and presented Patricia with the final non-negotiable vacate order. When she refused to leave and locked herself inside the master bedroom, the deputies simply breached the door and physically escorted her off the premises. Then came the most humiliating part of her downfall. A county-approved moving crew arrived and began hauling her expensive designer furniture, her crystal chandeliers, and her racks of luxury clothing right out onto the front lawn. Her entire fake royal life was unceremoniously dumped onto the curb of the exclusive suburban street she used to rule. The neighbors she had spent years looking down upon stood on their manicured lawns, watching the spectacle with undisguised shock and morbid curiosity. The country club women she had desperately tried to impress whispered and pointed as Patricia sat on a cheap plastic moving box, completely ruined and sobbing openly in the driveway. She had absolutely nowhere to go, no hidden assets to fall back on, and no golden child to rescue her. Because her golden child was currently sitting in a holding cell at the Federal Detention Center downtown. True to her word, Judge Montgomery had forwarded the entire metadata file and the forged promissory note directly to the district attorney. A joint task force, focusing on federal identity theft and wire fraud, swooped in exactly 4 days after our court appearance. Federal agents arrested Ashley in the parking lot of her favorite upscale yoga studio. She was handcuffed in front of her wealthy friends, stripped of her designer yoga pants at the county jail, and issued a standard orange jumpsuit. The fraud she had committed against Andre was so extensive and well documented that the prosecutors denied her initial request for bail. Even if the judge had granted bail, Ashley had absolutely no way to pay it. Andre had moved with the ruthless precision of a skilled surgeon, excising a malignant tumor. The very same afternoon he walked out of the courtroom and left his wedding ring on the defense table, he contacted his own high-powered legal team. He immediately filed for a brutal, heavily contested divorce. He submitted the court transcripts, proving she had stolen his social security number to secure the emergency financial injunctions. By sunset that evening, Andre had completely frozen every single joint bank account, canceled every shared credit card, and legally locked Ashley out of his pristine financial ecosystem. She was left absolutely destitute. She could not afford to hire a decent criminal defense attorney, let alone fight a high-stakes divorce battle against a man with an 820 credit score and unlimited resources. She was assigned an overworked public defender who immediately advised her to take a plea deal to avoid spending a decade in federal prison. The toxic duo had spent their entire lives manipulating everyone around them, feeding off the generosity of good men like Daniel and Andre. Now the host bodies had severed the connection, and the parasites were rapidly starving to death in the harsh light of reality. While their worlds burned to the ground, my life was finally transforming into something incredibly beautiful and quiet. I spent my days working from my home office, rebuilding my accounting firm, and spending every free moment with my growing baby boy. My house was small compared to the colonial mansion my mother had occupied, but it was filled with warmth, genuine laughter, and an absolute sense of safety. I did not receive any more threatening letters. I did not get ambushed in my driveway by arrogant women waving forged documents. I simply watched the legal updates roll into my inbox, observing the total collapse of my enemies from a safe, comfortable distance. The violent storm had finally passed forever, leaving the ground completely clear for me to build something entirely new for my son and myself. Every single painful sacrifice had been worth it. The quiet peace of my new life was occasionally punctuated by the necessary business of closing out my husband's estate. The largest remaining asset was the sprawling colonial mansion on Oak Creek Drive. Once the sheriff's department had officially cleared my mother from the premises, I hired a professional cleaning crew to scrub the entire house from top to bottom. Walking through those massive empty rooms for the first time was a surreal experience. The walls that had once echoed with my mother's boastful country club parties and my sister's entitled demands were now completely silent and hollow. Without Patricia's expensive designer furniture masking the flaws, the house revealed itself to be just a building. It was not a royal palace. It was just a structure of wood, brick, and drywall that had been propped up by my late husband's secret generosity. I did not feel a single ounce of nostalgia standing in the grand foyer. I only saw an incredibly valuable asset waiting to be liquidated. I quickly hired a top-tier real estate agent who specialized in luxury suburban properties and instructed her to list the house immediately. I wanted a fast, ruthless sale to completely sever this final tie. The real estate market in that specific zip code was fiercely competitive. Because the property was located in a highly coveted school district and boasted a newly renovated heated swimming pool, we received multiple offers within the first 48 hours. My agent called me on a Tuesday morning with the final breakdown. We bypassed the buyers who needed complex mortgage approvals or lengthy contingencies. Instead, we accepted a massive all-cash offer from an international tech executive who was relocating his family to the area. The final sale price was an astounding $1.8 million. The closing process was incredibly smooth and completely devoid of any emotional attachment. I sat in a sleek conference room at the title company sipping sparkling water as I signed my name across a stack of legal documents. I was legally transferring the physical embodiment of my mother's toxic pride to a complete stranger. When the escrow officer confirmed the wire transfer had successfully cleared, a profound sense of finality washed over me. The money hit my corporate bank accounts in a single massive wave of liquid capital. The grand illusion my mother had desperately clung to was finally gone, forever converted entirely into pure financial power. But I had absolutely no intention of letting that money sit idle or become a point of contention in the future. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how fragile wealth could be if it was not properly protected. I immediately scheduled another meeting with Richard at his downtown law firm. I walked into his spacious office, took a comfortable seat across from his mahogany desk, and told him exactly what I wanted to do with the $1.8 million. We were going to build an impenetrable financial fortress for my son. I instructed Richard to establish an ironclad, irrevocable trust fund. I was meticulously specific about the legal parameters. This was not going to be a slush fund for luxury cars or reckless spending. The trust was strictly designated for my son's educational expenses, his essential healthcare needs, and his future business or real estate investments once he reached the age of 30. Furthermore, I required Richard to draft extremely aggressive exclusionary clauses into the trust documents. I explicitly named my mother Patricia and my sister Ashley, permanently barring them from ever accessing, managing, or benefiting from a single penny of the fund. Even if I were to pass away unexpectedly, the legal structure ensured that my blood relatives could never petition the courts to gain control of the money by using my son as a pawn. The trust would be managed by an independent, highly vetted corporate fiduciary, removing any possibility of emotional manipulation or family greed. Richard reviewed my stipulations carefully, his silver pen flying across his legal pad. He was deeply impressed by the sheer ruthlessness of my strategic financial planning. By the end of that week, the legal documents were finalized, signed, and officially filed with the state. I held the heavy leather-bound trust portfolio in my hands, feeling the physical weight of my son's guaranteed future. My mother had tried to steal $300,000 to maintain her fake aristocratic lifestyle. In her arrogant attempt to destroy me, she had inadvertently handed me the exact tool I needed to secure nearly $2 million in untainted generational wealth for my child. She had tried to leave us with absolutely nothing, but her greed ultimately financed a beautiful, untouchable future for the very grandson she had ignored. I locked the portfolio inside my safe. Exactly 1 year after the absolute darkest night of my life, my home was filled with a bright, overwhelming warmth. It was a crisp spring Saturday, the exact day of my son Leo's first birthday. I stood in my kitchen, looking out through the large glass doors into the backyard, listening to the incredible sound of genuine, unfiltered laughter. The contrast to the terrifying, sterile silence of the emergency room a year ago was so profound it almost brought me to tears. But these were tears of absolute gratitude, not sorrow. I had spent the past 12 months meticulously clearing the rot from my life, and now my home was filled exclusively with the people I had actively chosen. My chosen family. The backyard was beautifully decorated with bright blue and silver balloons catching the afternoon sunlight. A large custom-ordered cake sat on the patio table, shaped like a little red fire truck. I watched my son toddle clumsily across the manicured grass, his small hands reaching out toward a brightly colored toy. He let out a loud, joyous squeal, completely unaware of the massive legal and emotional war that had been fought to secure his peaceful existence. He did not know about the forged documents, the evictions, or the federal indictments. He only knew love's stability and the absolute safety of his home. I walked out onto the patio carrying a tray of fresh appetizers. Richard, my formidable probate attorney, was standing near the barbecue grill, wearing a casual polo shirt instead of his usual intimidating tailored suits. He was laughing deeply at a joke told by my senior accounting partner. Richard had officially retired from full-time litigation 3 months ago, but he had remained a steady grandfatherly presence in our lives. He looked over at me and raised his glass of iced tea in a silent, respectful toast. I smiled back, deeply thankful for the ruthless brilliance he had brought into the courtroom that day. Near the wooden swing set, a group of my colleagues from the forensic accounting firm were cheering loudly as Leo successfully stacked a set of wooden blocks. They were the people who had covered my caseload while I was recovering from surgery, the people who had brought me hot meals when I was navigating the early days of widowhood completely alone. They were not connected to me by blood, but they had shown up in my darkest hours with a fierce loyalty my biological family had never possessed. But the most surprising and beautiful addition to my chosen family was the tall man currently lifting my son high into the air, spinning him around until they were both breathless with laughter. Andre. Following the devastating revelations in the courtroom, Andre and I had maintained a steady, supportive connection. The brutal divorce had completely finalized 6 months ago. Ashley had been sentenced to 36 months in a minimum security federal facility, and Andre had officially reclaimed his life. He had walked through the fire of ultimate betrayal, but it had not hardened his heart. Instead, he channeled his energy into his medical practice and into being a consistent, positive male figure in Leo's life. He came over for Sunday dinners, helped me assemble complex nursery furniture, and brought the same silver rattle he had tried to deliver on the day of the driveway ambush. He was no longer just the brother-in-law who had been deceived by my sister. He was an uncle. He was a trusted friend. He was family. I set the tray of food down on the table and walked over to them. Andre gently lowered Leo back down to the grass, his face flushed with exertion and genuine joy. "He looks just like Daniel when he smiles," Andre said softly, looking down at the little boy holding onto his pant leg. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, a quiet longing for my late husband, but it was no longer a sharp, paralyzing pain. It was a soft, enduring love. "Yes, he does," I agreed, reaching down to brush a stray curl from Leo's forehead. "He has Daniel's eyes, and hopefully he will have his incredibly generous heart." But I will make sure he also knows how to read a balance sheet and spot a forged signature from a mile away." Andre let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed across the yard. "Oh, I have absolutely no doubt about that, Cassidy. This boy is going to be the most financially literate toddler in the entire state. With you as a mother, nobody is ever going to pull the wool over his eyes." We stood there together in the warm sunlight, watching the people we cared about talk and celebrate. I had lost the family I was born into, but looking around my vibrant backyard, I realized I had not actually lost anything of value. I had merely traded a toxic illusion for a beautiful, undeniable reality. The heavy weight of the past year had finally lifted, replaced by a deep, unwavering peace. A few weeks after the birthday party, the vibrant energy of the celebration settled back into the quiet, comfortable routine of our daily lives. The spring weather had fully arrived, bringing bright sunshine and blooming flowers to our quiet neighborhood. I was walking back from the mailbox at the end of the driveway on a mild Tuesday afternoon, sorting through a mundane stack of utility bills, corporate tax documents, and colorful grocery store circulars. I was entirely relaxed, listening to the gentle rustling of the wind through the oak trees. Then my fingers brushed against a cheap, thin white envelope buried in the middle of the stack. I stopped walking. I stared down at the handwritten ink on the front of the envelope. The handwriting was shaky, rushed and noticeably unrefined, but I recognized it instantly. It was my mother's handwriting. I shifted my gaze to the top left corner to read the return address. It did not list a luxury country club or an upscale suburban street. It listed a state correctional and rehabilitation facility located 200 miles away. Patricia had ultimately avoided the harsh federal prison sentence that Ashley received by accepting a heavily negotiated plea deal for her role in the conspiracy, but she had not escaped entirely. She was currently serving an 18-month sentence in a state-mandated facility, completely stripped of her designer clothes, her expensive cosmetics, and her fabricated dignity. I stood in the middle of my driveway holding the letter. A year ago, an envelope like this would have sent my nervous system into absolute shock. My heart would have raced, my palms would have started sweating, and a crushing wave of conditioned guilt would have instantly suffocated me. I would have rushed inside, frantically torn the paper open, and agonized over every single manipulative word written inside. But standing there in the warm sunlight, I realized something profound. My heart rate had not increased by a single beat. My breathing remained perfectly steady. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I knew exactly what was written on the pages folded inside that envelope. I did not need to read it to know the script. It would be a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Patricia would beg for my forgiveness. She would weaponize her current misery, describing the awful conditions of her facility to elicit my pity. She would claim she had found religion or experienced a massive spiritual awakening. She would remind me that she gave birth to me leaning heavily on the societal expectation that a daughter owes her mother an infinite reservoir of grace. She would ask for a second chance, and inevitably she would ask me to put money into her prison commissary account. I walked up the driveway and stepped inside my beautiful safe home. I locked the front door behind me. I bypassed the kitchen completely and walked straight down the hallway into my home office. The room was immaculate, lined with heavy bookshelves and my dual-monitor accounting setup. Tucked neatly beneath my mahogany desk was a heavy-duty, cross-cut industrial paper shredder, a necessary tool for destroying highly sensitive financial documents. Society constantly pushes a deeply toxic narrative about family. We are told from a very young age that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned to believe that you must always forgive your parents no matter how terribly they treat you, simply because you share the same genetic sequence. But my career as a forensic accountant had taught me a very different truth. Some debts are fundamentally uncollectible. Some ledgers are so deeply compromised by fraud and abuse that they must be permanently closed and written off entirely. Sharing DNA does not entitle someone to a front row seat to your life. It does not grant them an all-access pass to inflict trauma, disappear when you are bleeding, and then demand re-entry when they have completely ruined their own lives. I reached down and flipped the power switch on the shredder. The machine hummed to life with a low mechanical growl. I held the cheap white envelope directly over the steel slot. I did not open it. I did not read a single word my mother had written. I simply let the envelope slip from my fingers. The steel teeth caught the paper instantly. The machine let out a loud, satisfying grinding noise as it pulled the letter downward, violently pulverizing the pleas, the lies, and the manipulation into thousands of tiny, illegible shreds of confetti. It took less than 3 seconds to completely destroy the final tether my mother had tried to cast into my life. I flipped the power switch off, plunging the office back into a peaceful silence. The ultimate boundary was not just drawn, it was permanently sealed in steel and concrete. Toxic people do not get second chances in my life, regardless of their biological titles. I turned off the office light and walked upstairs to the nursery. I stood in the doorway watching my son sleep soundly in his crib. His small chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression of absolute victory. The cycle of generational abuse was permanently broken. I gently closed the nursery door and walked confidently into our beautiful, untouchable future. I walked down the carpeted hallway, the soft glow of the nightlight casting long shadows against the walls. The house was entirely still, filled with a deep, comforting quiet that I had fought a brutal and unforgiving war to secure. I made my way downstairs, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floors, and walked into the darkened living room. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a single silver-framed photograph of Daniel. He was smiling, that bright, generous smile of his, standing on the beach the day he asked me to marry him. I did not feel the sudden crushing wave of despair that used to knock the breath from my lungs. Instead, I felt a profound, enduring sense of gratitude. Daniel was a man who gave far too much of himself. His generosity was his defining trait, but it was also his fatal flaw. He operated under the heartbreaking belief that if he just gave enough money, enough time, and enough of his own energy, the toxic people in his orbit would eventually learn to love him. He was wrong. Parasites do not ever love the host. They merely consume the resources until there is absolutely nothing left to take. His death was a catastrophic loss, a sudden and violent wound that permanently altered the trajectory of my life. But standing in the quiet sanctuary of my home looking at his photograph, I could finally acknowledge the hard, undeniable truth. That tragedy was the ultimate catalyst. The fire of his sudden absence burned away the thick canopy of lies that had suffocated my entire existence. I often think back to that freezing recovery room in the maternity ward. I remember the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the agonizing physical pain of the emergency surgery. But more than anything else, I remember the absolute deafening silence from my phone. The absence of my mother and sister while they drank vintage champagne in Paris was the most agonizing betrayal I had ever experienced. Yet looking back with the absolute clarity of hindsight, I realized their silence was not a weapon at all. It was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. That silence shattered the lifelong illusion of biological obligation. It completely freed me from the heavy emotional debt I had been paying for the simple crime of being born into their bloodline. Society constantly demands that we honor our biological relatives simply because we share a genetic sequence. We are aggressively conditioned to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek, and to quietly endure the subtle insults and the blatant financial exploitations for the sake of maintaining family harmony. But blood does not make a family. Loyalty, respect, and showing up in the darkest hours do. A true family is forged in the intense crucible of real life. It is built in the sterile hospital waiting rooms, in the quiet, desperate moments of overwhelming grief, and in the unwavering support you receive when your entire world is falling apart. My family is Richard ruthlessly dismantling my enemies in a public courtroom without a single ounce of hesitation. My family is my accounting colleagues showing up at my front door with hot meals to feed a grieving widow. My family is Andre stepping up with absolute grace to be a strong, reliable uncle to a little boy who lost his father. I lost my husband, but I gained my absolute freedom. The grief used to feel like a heavy, suffocating blanket dragging me down into the dark, but now it feels like an impenetrable suit of armor. I survived the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to a woman. I was abandoned, widowed, and targeted by predators when I was at my most vulnerable. And yet, I emerged on the exact opposite side, completely untouchable. I am no longer the quiet, obedient younger sister, desperate for a tiny scrap of maternal affection. I am a forensic accountant who audited her own life and ruthlessly liquidated every single toxic liability. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of cold water. I leaned against the cool marble counter looking out the large bay window as the first faint light of dawn began creeping over the suburban horizon. The world was waking up fresh, vibrant, and entirely untouched by the darkness of yesterday. If there is one thing this brutal, exhausting journey has taught me, it is the absolute, non-negotiable value of your own peace. You do not have to tolerate emotional or financial abuse just because it is served to you on a familial plate. You do not have to swallow poison just because it is poured by someone you happen to share a last name with. If you are sitting at a table where you are not respected, buy the restaurant, evict the toxic diners, and dine in peace. I set my glass down on the counter and smiled. The ledger is perfectly balanced, the debts are completely settled, and for the very first time in my life, the future belongs entirely to me.